for you. The U.S. government, between the NIH, USAID, and interestingly the U.S. military, are major funders of vaccine research around the world. Why should the average American care? Because they're footing the bill. Why should the average American see this as value for money, if you will, that really makes a difference for American interests?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons there. One of them is, the reason the military has been involved in this is, of course, we're in a lot of places around the world, and the technologies that have been developed by the military on tropical diseases have a use more broadly. And so I've been to research stations in Kenya, the country of Kenya, that are American military institutions that have been doing this for 50 years or 100 years in some cases, looking at these kind of diseases. So, America's had a traditional interest in these ideas. We, of course, have an interest in being, a leader in these technologies as far as competitiveness, as far as the American economy. I know you guys probably provide all the figures, but there are many kind of states in the country that have a particular interest in this industry, where this is not just a major employer, but is important to their academic infrastructure, to a lot of other, what they do. So there's a narrow economic interest, and we shouldn't discount that. I think it's quite important. But I think the broader interest here, if you talk with our military leaders, you talk with someone like Bob Gates, or you talk with David Petraeus, we've undergone a revolution in the way that we view American power in the last 10 years. From being primarily military in a lot of circumstances to a much greater emphasis on soft power and how we exert influence in distant parts of the world. It's David Petraeus that talks about how the decisive terrain is the human terrain. And it's very much the kind of military emphasis in the way they do training and a lot of other things. And of course, that was the hard lesson of Afghanistan and Iraq and the way that counterinsurgency works. But it's much broader than that. It's also the way that we exert power in the world, and how our, these elements of soft power help achieve American interests. So I recently saw a very interesting poll among post 9/11 military officers that came into the military post 9/11. And they talk about how these civilian instruments, development and diplomacy, in their view, are equally important to the military instruments in the achievement of the national interest. And that's the way American military officers are trained now, and given this experience. So they're some of the greatest advocates. You get someone like Bob Gates, who is one of the few cabinet officers that I know of that called for increasing the State Department programs in these areas. Increase somebody else's budget. And I think that's because of people who are on the ground, that I have a great deal of respect for, understand that power is not just military power. That we exert our influence on world events in much different ways.
Margie, with that being said, that there is a role for the U.S. government to support early stage research and some of these neglected disease areas to actually fill that gap that is there, that because there aren't adequate incentives for industry. What is it going to take? When will industry step in? So for an HIV vaccine, which ultimately, let's say, is global and will have real markets, what are the considerations, and how can the government look to private industry picking up its share of the ticket, if you will, to get vaccines to market? What are the considerations that companies will go through?
Sure, and I'm sure many of you are aware that there have been many companies involved over I guess it's almost 20 years now. We've been looking at 25 years for an HIV vaccine, including the company I worked for, spent a lot of money on HIV vaccine trials and unfortunately had a failed trial. So industry is willing to step in first when there is proof of concept. So there's an academic lab or a small biotech company or a PDP like IAVI with a consortium, has established proof of concept, so that scientific risk is lowered. And so that's important, and that's when many projects will see the light of day. Licensing activity will occur to bring it in-house and move forward. But the other has to be the financial risk, and while, David, certainly the ideal vaccine would have relevance globally in high-income markets as well, that's not always true. And in fact, the vaccine that Merck had been working on, no one expected that it would actually prevent infection. It would stimulate the immune response for someone who had already been exposed and infected. And so in that case, Merck did not expect that vaccine to have a real market in the developed world, because you had ARV therapy that was able to control infection for those already infected. And so when you look at an equation like that, you ask yourself, well, how do I justify to my investors spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on phase 3 trial, on capacity development, et cetera? And that's where partnerships like PDPs and like many of the grants that come from foundations such as the Gates Foundation or Wellcome Trust are very critical. And I was in charge of the commercial aspects of the HIV program at Merck. And so I had to come up with a strategy to justify the capacity development, because we were ready to start investing in a contract manufacturer to build supplies for a phase 3 trial. And so the approach that I was working on would be to find a funder, such as a foundation or government, that is willing to fund that capacity development for the manufacturing capacity, because the volumes that would be needed for the developing world would be probably unlike anything we've ever seen before in the world of vaccines. And so how could that be done in a way that I wouldn't expect as a manufacturer to make money on it, but the problem is I can't lose money on it. I can't risk all of the capital coming from investors when you're talking about that big an investment to do the right thing. And so you have to have mechanisms such as a PDP who's going to help you lower that financial risk. And it can be done in many different ways. It can be done as a grant, which IAVI and other organizations, I'm sure MBI does it, the TV Alliance does it, provides grants to biotech companies or pharma companies to do some of the initial work. IAVI has done that through a discovery grant program, and that's yielded some promising results. In fact, one of the results, there was a grant given to Theravance, and they developed their screening program. And as a sign that really was validated, Pfizer then invested about $630 million into a program with Theravance to apply that program. I believe it was in the area of oncology. And so there are all sorts of mechanisms that can be applied to lower that financial risk, so that companies can take the capabilities they have, because that's what's needed to go into phase 3 trials and to produce the huge quantities of supply that are needed to launch a critical therapy or vaccine in an area like this. And so these mechanisms are critical, and the funding is critical to be there to enable these mechanisms to occur.
Great. We're getting towards the end of our session. Time for one more question, and then I'll try to summarize.
Pariwala Results for Development Institute. Just to follow up on the remark, Margie, you just provided on incentives. With regards to getting to proof of concept, what other incentives or new mechanisms do you think can be used, beyond traditional financing like grants? There's been a lot of talk about prizes, for example. Do you think that would help?
Yeah, I will tell you, sitting on the board of a small biotech company, while prizes have a nice ring to them, when you're talking about how many months of cash flow do I have left, you can't invest in going after the prize. And so it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. If you want a company, especially biotech companies, the majority of which are not profitable and are venture-backed, if you want them to be able to commit their capabilities, grants really are a critical approach to this. Also, incentives such as sharing, across a consortium, like some of the work done with IAVI, that can provide not only incentives to companies to get involved, but it gives them a higher likelihood of success knowing that others are sharing their discoveries and they can work in a more collaborative way. So I really think the direct grants is a much more compelling process for biotech companies. If you're talking about large pharma companies, things like incentives for fast track review, things like that can help, but I think it's really the small biotech companies that you want to think about in the area of incentives for innovation.
Thank you. So we are coming to the end. I'm going to just try to summarize some of the topics that we've covered. So one of the things I think we've heard is, if you will, vaccines are really a best buy in global health. They're the ability to prevent, frankly, at low cost per individual that's treated with a vaccine, make it a really compelling technology. And in the case of HIV, you prevent a lifelong infection, which requires lifelong therapy. There are urgent needs for new vaccines. Just between TB, malaria, and HIV, 4 to 5 million deaths per year. These are, importantly, they're technological frontiers that ultimately will pay back the American economy. So just to put a little bit of a technical spin, these are hard because they involve cellular vaccines, T cells, but T cells are involved in cancer, they're involved in hepatitis C, they're involved in autoimmunity, and breakthroughs that are being funded by PDPs will ultimately lead to breakthroughs in other areas. Investing in global health is critical to U.S. interests. We've heard about the national security interests, the interests of the military, the use of soft power, and the influence that we can exert by providing vaccines around the world. We've talked about innovative ways of financing and the government's role, the role of a public-private development partnership, having industry do what it can properly do, but not having it do what it really shouldn't be doing, which is, frankly, losing money. And in addition to the economic benefits in the US, there are real economic benefits in the developing world. Establishing capacity, building human capital, and creating conditions where, in the long run, we have stable communities and stable governments is ultimately going to be in our interest. So I think with that, we'd like to close the session. It's been great having each of our speakers. Again, I'd like to thank Senator Brown and his staff for hosting this session. Thank you very much.